I have lived long enough to understand that nothing in politics happens in a vacuum. When crowds pour into the streets with banners held high, when chants rise into the air like a chorus of rebellion, the first question I ask is not what they are saying, but who made it possible for them to be there. Mass movements in the United States have never been purely spontaneous. They are nurtured, constructed, and sustained by networks of finance and organization. The so-called No Kings protests were no exception. From the outside, they appeared to be a grassroots uprising, a moral outcry against concentrated power, but beneath the surface, they were powered by a carefully assembled machine of nonprofit structures, funding streams, and activist networks that transform discontent into a coordinated spectacle. I watched these protests form as one observes a storm gathering over a distant horizon. It was not by chance that thousands of people showed up at once with unified slogans and coordinated messaging. Behind the movement stood a web of hundreds of organizations, many of them registered as nonprofit entities that allow political engagement while shielding donor identities. These were not local clubs meeting in basements. They were professional advocacy networks equipped with money, media strategies, and legal frameworks designed to maximize political pressure. They operated through nonprofit channels that blurred the lines between civic engagement and direct political confrontation. One of the central hubs was Indivisible, a name that became synonymous with the infrastructure of coordinated protest. Its funding flowed from major philanthropic sources, including the Open Society foundations, which publicly framed their support as an investment in democratic participation. Around this core gathered other groups, civil liberties organizations, radical political formations, and established activist movements that shared contact lists, mobilized turnout, and amplified each other's reach. It was not a single movement. It was an ecosystem, each branch feeding the next. It was designed to be resilient, difficult to trace, and effective. The money was not spent on ideology alone. It paid for logistics, for signage and transportation, for professional organizers who understood how to sustain momentum long after the first march ended. Every rally was also a fundraiser. Every chant was an opportunity to collect more donations to feed the machine that had built the stage in the first place. In many ways, this is the modern American protest, not just a cry of the heart, but a political industry refined over decades that turns emotion into leverage and leverage into power. I do not say this to diminish the moral conviction of those who marched. Many believed deeply in what they were doing, but the reality of modern protest movements is that their reach and their endurance depend less on spontaneous moral outrage and more on the strategic and financial scaffolding behind them. When citizens believe they are standing alone, they are often standing on a platform built for them long before they arrived. That is the quiet architecture of American dissent. It is as real as the slogans shouted on the street, and far more enduring. I have often said that history's most dangerous illusions are the ones we create about ourselves Every society tells itself a flattering story, a tale of moral clarity and spontaneous civic virtue. But the true structure of power always lies beneath the story. Uh, America has long believed that its democratic culture is powered by ordinary citizens rising up in righteous defiance. In reality, many of these moments have been carefully built, funded, and sustained by well-organized networks long before a single voice was raised in the streets. The No Kings protests were not born from a sudden moral awakening. They were the product of deliberate organization, of financial and political architecture designed to shape the performance of dissent. The core of the movement rested on a network of nonprofit organizations that functioned as political engines. Their legal structure shielded donor identities, allowing money to flow quietly into campaigns of extraordinary scale. This was not a few individuals sending emails from kitchen tables. It was a coordinated system that linked national funders, advocacy groups, and activist coalitions. One major organizing hub was Indivisible, which became a rallying point for progressive infrastructure. Around it, a constellation of civil rights groups, ideological formations, and activist networks worked in concert. They shared lists, coordinated messaging, and moved with a level of strategic precision that only comes from planning, not chance. Even organizations with vastly different political histories found common cause in amplifying turnout and narrative reach. The funding mechanisms were layered and often opaque. Philanthropic foundations, including Open Society, described their contributions as support for democratic participation, but the effect was a vast reservoir of financial resources flowing through nonprofit channels with limited transparency. That money built the stage upon which the protests stood. It paid for transportation, for banners, for media operations, for professional organizers who ensured that marches did not dissipate after a single day. It created continuity, and continuity created power. Modern American protest is not merely a burst of emotion. It is an industry. It has its professionals, its funding streams, its legal frameworks, its trained organizers, and its media strategies. Its capacity to shape the public conversation often exceeds that of elected institutions themselves. This is both its strength and its danger. On one hand, it can mobilize extraordinary civic energy against perceived injustice. On the other hand, it can obscure the line between genuine democratic participation and orchestrated political theater. Citizens often believe they are acting alone when, in truth, they are entering a pre-constructed arena built for them by forces they cannot see. This hidden architecture of protest reveals something essential about the current state of American democracy. The republic no longer relies solely on civic virtue to animate its movements. It relies on networks of power that operate in the shadows of legality. This is not unique to one ideology. The same structure has been mirrored across the spectrum, but it speaks to a larger truth when movements become professional industries. Their capacity to inspire can be matched by their capacity to manipulate, and that is when a democracy begins to drift away from its moral foundations towards something colder, more strategic, and less accountable. I have often reflected on the uncomfortable truth that in a modern democracy, money has learned to speak louder than conviction. What begins as an ideal often becomes a mechanism shaped by the hands of those who know how to build movements like they build campaigns. The No Kings protests did not grow like wild grass in the wind. They were cultivated with strategy, structure, and capital. That does not make the anger of those who marched less real, but it does reveal how their anger was absorbed into a larger design. When you trace the chain of organization, you find not an invisible hand, but a carefully visible architecture hiding in plain sight. Central to this architecture was the nonprofit network that shielded the financial scaffolding of the movement. These structures allowed large sums of money to flow into organizing efforts with little to no public accountability. It was a legal structure, but one built to maximize political impact. Funding came through philanthropic foundations that publicly described their mission as supporting civic participation. But the effect was more specific and more forceful. It created the logistical backbone of a movement that appeared spontaneous. The protest had media strategies, coordination hubs, national messaging, and experienced organizers on the ground. That level of precision does not happen overnight. The alliances surrounding the movement were just as significant as the money itself. Civil rights groups, ideological networks, activist formations each played their role, pooling contacts, coordinating narratives, and amplifying turnout. Even organizations with different agendas found a common purpose in opposing the political order. They sought to challenge. This was a coalition built not on shared faith, but on shared utility. It had the adaptability of a professional network able to sustain attention long after the headlines faded. This raises a moral question about the nature of modern democratic expression. When protest becomes a well-financed machine, does it still speak with the raw voice of the people, or does it speak with the voice of those who built the machine? This tension is not unique to one political side. Both left and right have learned to engineer movements this way. What changes is the story told to the public, a story of grassroots courage that conceals the invisible infrastructure beneath it. I have seen this pattern repeat across decades, from anti-war protests to election movements to mass mobilizations against presidents. The language changes, the targets shift, but the machinery remains, and yet the moral reality is complex. Many who march do so because they believe they are not puppets, they are participants, but their participation takes place inside a structure they did not design. That is the paradox of modern protest. It is both genuine and engineered, both emotional and strategic. The banners are handmade, but the stage is built long before the first chant is heard. To understand the health of a republic, one must learn to see not only the protester in the street, but the architecture beneath their feet. That is where power resides. That is where democracy either endures or begins to erode. I have seen this pattern repeat across history, like an echo that grows louder with each passing decade. Whenever the visible face of a movement is held up as proof of democratic vitality, its invisible structure often tells a more sobering story. The No Kings protest carried the language of popular will, but their durability and reach came not from a sudden spark of outrage, but from networks already in place, networks that understood how to turn discontent into momentum and momentum into influence. That is how power operates when it no longer wears a crown, but moves through structures built to appear leaderless. The architecture behind the movement functioned with the quiet efficiency of a seasoned campaign. Nonprofit organizations formed their backbone, their legal status, allowing significant streams of money to flow in without disclosing who stood behind the curtain. That is how modern movements are sustained, not only by passion, but by financing that shapes their scale, messaging, and endurance. One of the key coordination hubs was Indivisible, surrounded by civil liberties groups and activist formations that shared resources, contact lists, and strategies. It was not a single organization, but a coalition elastic, well-funded and disciplined. The money was layered, passing through philanthropic foundations that described their work as promoting democratic participation, but in effect, financing a strategic political counterforce. The infrastructure of protest has grown sophisticated because modern power itself has grown sophisticated. It no longer requires a palace or a party to shape the national conversation. It requires networks, funding pipelines, and the ability to sustain attention in a fragmented information landscape. The protests were choreographed in their timing, amplified by media strategies, and reinforced by professional organizers who ensured that the energy did not evaporate after a single day in the streets. They operated as both a moral statement and a calculated political instrument. This duality is the heart of the modern democratic paradox. Protest movements still carry the faces of ordinary citizens, but behind them stand complex networks of funding, legal shields, and strategic planners. This does not make the movements illegitimate, but it does reveal that their power is rarely as simple as it appears. I have often warned that when politics becomes theater, truth becomes fragile. And when truth becomes fragile, democracy is reduced to performance, a contest not of ideas, but of who can construct the most convincing spectacle. The American Republic was not built for this kind of permanent, professionally organized mobilization. It was built on a belief that civic action would arise from communities themselves, not be engineered by financial networks with strategic agendas. That is why the stakes of this transformation are so high. When the architecture of protest becomes indistinguishable from the architecture of power, the boundary between people and machine begins to blur. And when that happens, a republic slowly loses the very moral clarity that once made it strong. I have often reflected on how fragile truth becomes when power learns to disguise itself as the voice of the people. The modern protest no longer lives in the same moral space as the civil disobedience of past generations. It has become an instrument polished, deliberate, and calibrated to move public opinion with precision. What the world saw in the No Kings protests was not only a wave of anger, but also a narrative machine finely tuned to dominate the public conversation. Behind every chant, there was a strategy. Behind every crowd, a network. Behind every banner, a ledger. In an earlier age, protest drew its strength from a shared moral vocabulary. Movements like the civil rights struggle spoke from the ground up, often with little money and few institutional allies. Their power came from moral clarity, from their ability to expose injustice so raw that it forced the conscience of a nation to respond. But this era is different. Protests today exist in a vast media environment where attention is currency and perception shapes reality more than facts. Those who control the narrative control the frame through which events are seen, and those who control the resources can ensure that their version of the story is told loudly, repeatedly, and with the appearance of authenticity. The infrastructure surrounding the No Kings protests exemplified this shift. The funding was routed through organizations designed to shield identities, allowing donors to operate beyond the reach of public accountability. The coordination was national, not local, crafted through networks that could mobilize quickly, shape headlines, and amplify messages across digital platforms. Activists on the ground believed they were acting spontaneously, but the timing of their actions matched carefully laid plans. Media coverage was not an accident. It was anticipated, choreographed, and leveraged to give the movement a moral weight that far exceeded its organic base. This is not unique to one side of the political spectrum. The machinery of modern protest has been replicated, mirrored, and adapted by opposing forces. It is now a standard tool in the arsenal of political influence. But this normalization of engineered dissent carries deep moral consequences. When protest becomes a professionalized performance, truth is no longer a common ground. Each movement tells its own story, paints its own reality, and recruits its own chorus of believers. Public trust fractures, shared facts dissolve. The very notion of democracy, that truth can emerge from collective deliberation, begins to disintegrate. The tragedy is that within these movements are real people, driven by genuine beliefs, unaware of how their voices are woven into a larger pattern, designed by those who will never march beside them. This is not to dismiss their courage, but to confront the reality of how easily human energy can be harnessed by unseen power. In a democracy, when truth bends to strategy and dissent becomes a performance, the republic begins to lose its moral compass. It does not fall all at once. it erodes one protest, one manipulated narrative, one carefully engineered moment at a time. I have lived through enough turning points in history to recognize when a republic begins to lose its balance. The most dangerous moment is not when the streets are loud, but when the truth becomes quiet, when power hides behind movements it did not create but carefully shapes, when protest becomes less a voice of the people and more a tool in the hands of those who understand how to build and sustain a narrative. This is what I saw in the No Kings protest, the merging of genuine emotion with calculated power, a convergence that does not destroy democracy outright, but weakens its moral foundation piece by piece. The American experiment was built on the fragile principle of restraint. The framers understood that power is always tempted to break its own boundaries, and that democratic life depends on the ability of institutions and citizens alike to practice self-limitation. But modern politics has abandoned this ethic. Power no longer hides its appetite. It celebrates it. It seeks control not only over the machinery of government, but over the language of democracy itself. When political forces learn to shape the theater of protest, they can bend the meaning of civic action to their own will. In such a world, restraint becomes a relic, and every act of dissent is folded into a larger strategic contest for dominance. The networks behind the protests operated with that logic. Their goal was not only to express opposition, but to maintain pressure over time, to seize narrative control, to make their framing unavoidable. They built alliances across ideological lines when it was useful, coordinated national actions with local fronts, and crafted a protest movement that looked spontaneous but was anything but. This was not the roar of a crowd breaking through power. It was powerful speaking through a crowd. It is a subtle but devastating inversion. This is how democratic institutions begin to wither. When movements are engineered to project moral legitimacy without requiring moral accountability, they become a substitute for real civic life. Citizens are reduced to participants in a script they did not write, repeating slogans designed elsewhere, reinforcing structures they cannot see. The theater of democracy becomes more elaborate, but the substance of democracy becomes thinner, and the more power flows through these hidden channels, the less restraint remains to hold the system together. I speak these words not in anger, but in warning. A republic cannot survive on spectacle alone. It cannot endure if truth becomes subordinate to strategy. If power moves unseen behind the language of the people. Restraint was once the moral architecture of American democracy. It kept ambition in check. It protected institutions from capture, and it preserved a space where truth could stand apart from faction. When that restraint collapses, democracy may still exist in form, but its soul begins to disappear. I have learned through the long arc of my life that republics do not collapse suddenly. They corrode slowly, quietly, beneath the noise of spectacle. The United States once prided itself on the strength of its civic institutions. on a shared belief that power was meant to be checked not only by law but by conscience. Yet when I look at what has unfolded in recent years, I see something far more fragile than the image the nation projects to itself. The No Kings protests revealed this vulnerability with clarity on the surface. They appeared as a movement of ordinary citizens confronting power, but underneath, they embodied the way modern politics absorbs moral language and transforms it into a weapon. The infrastructure of the movement was not an accident. It was the product of a system that allows vast sums of money to flow through hidden channels, networks that can shape national narratives without public accountability. These structures do not simply support protest, they define its scale, duration, and its framing. They allow power to move unseen, wearing the mask of the crowd. This is the new face of political influence. Not a single ruler on a throne, but 1,000 hidden hands operating behind a chorus of voices. When this becomes the norm, the moral foundation of democracy begins to fracture. Citizens no longer trust the voices they hear because they suspect, often rightly, that those voices may not be entirely their own. Movements become theater. Theater becomes politics, and politics becomes a contest over who can stage the most convincing performance. In this contest, truth is not lost all at once. It is eroded, chipped away each time. Strategy takes precedence over integrity. And when truth becomes negotiable, democracy becomes brittle. This is why restraint matters. The founders of the American Republic understood that power must be limited, not just by rules, but by culture, by the self-discipline of those who wield it and those who resist it. That ethic has been slowly abandoned. The movements that now shape the national stage are not simply protests. They are engines of influence operating in a competitive marketplace of narratives. Each one claims to speak for democracy. Few are willing to be bound by the discipline that democracy requires. If America wishes to endure as a republic, it must recover something that has been lost. It must reclaim the space where truth stands above strategy, where civic action belongs to citizens and not to unseen power. A republic cannot be ruled by money disguised as morality. It cannot survive if movements become merely the tools of those who wish to govern through spectacle rather than substance. The moral renewal of democracy will not come from louder chants or larger marches. It will come from restoring the bond between conscience and power, between truth and action. That is the real choice before America. It is not a struggle between left and right, between one leader and another. It is a struggle between truth and theater, between a republic governed by conscience and a spectacle governed by strategy. History is watching, and history is unforgiving to nations that forget the moral ground upon which they were built.